So welcome to Noteworthy's Insider Update. So today we're going to give you a quick behind the scenes view of our last 3 investigations and also answer some of the comments and questions that came in over the course of those investigations as well. So the 3 we're covering today are Racism at Work by Joseph Oakley, because she's off hiking in the mountains, but myself and Alice will fill everyone in on that investigation. And we also have Assessing Autism by Niall Sargent. So just to give you a bit of background on Noteworthy, so we're a crowd-funded, community-led platform from the Journal, and that we support independent and impactful public interest journalism, and it's funded by the public, and the ideas are sent in by the public as well. So we're just going to start off with Joseph, and thanks very much for joining us today, Joseph.
Yeah, thanks. It's good to be here.
If you want to give us a little bit of background about what the Racism at Work investigation was, and maybe a little bit about what you found.
Okay, so I did a feature on racism in Irish workplaces, and I've got to say that it's was a very enjoyable journey, from the start to finish, and there were some interesting findings from the piece, and I just thought it was nice to do that piece because it was obviously an important issue to highlight, especially in our present climate in Ireland. So there were some really interesting findings. The piece showed that there is racism in the workplace is on the rise in Ireland, and I was able to speak to a few people who have been impacted by this, and I spoke to a few experts as well, just to put the whole subject in context. I found some publications and figures from the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, as well as the Irish Network Against Racism, INAR, very telling. INAR, for example, compiles data of racism incidents annually, and they have this online reporting system going on called iReport, where people go on the website to report whatever they may have experienced. So the 2022 report showed that incidents of racial discrimination in Irish workplaces rose to 69 compared to 16, which was recorded in 2021. As I noted in my feature, those figures were only reported cases. So there were a lot of people who might have experienced racism, but didn't report it for so many reasons, which was also in the piece. A few reasons being the fact that some people don't have the courage to speak out, and a lot of people just don't want to challenge the companies they're working with, just because it might affect them. It might affect their future employers as well if they decided to leave. Another thing I found from my research was that in Irish workplaces, covert racism, or what some people like to call microaggression, seems to be more common, as opposed to things like use of explicit racial language. And so certain disguised behaviors, subtle remarks, were the kind of incidents that were mostly reported and experienced in the workplace. Where
maybe you can go into some of the, because I suppose that was featured in some of the people that you spoke to, and even some of the feedback, say in the comments or that we got afterwards was, well, how can you tell the difference between maybe a bad manager and racism and this type of microaggression? So maybe you can kind of give some examples of the stories that people told you and how like racism comes about in terms of that way.
Yeah, so questions like that, they are really legitimate questions, wanting to know what's the difference between, just being a bad manager and you being racially profiled or discriminated against, From the people I spoke to, they told me stories. In fact, there are two things actually you have to look at, for people who ask this kind of questions. And when you work at in a company, and especially when you're a minority and you're subjected to certain kinds of treatment other people are not subjected to. I mean, people who are white, you've got to ask questions, you've got to be concerned. This was the case with the two victims I spoke with. Another thing they pointed out to me was the fact that, this incident, kept on repeating itself, and, they didn't see those kind of complaints coming from their white counterparts. For example, one of the guys, told me that on his contract, when he started a job on his contract, it was stated that he was going to undergo certain trainings, but he didn't get that training. And the manager kept on, constantly criticizing him for not knowing his job, calling him names and insulting him. But when a white person joined the company, all the support was given to him. And, you could see clearly that, there was double standards there. Another person, told me about the culture in the company where, people are celebrated for their hard work. If they get promoted, the cards are signed, they have parties and stuff like that. But when it was her turn to get promoted, she didn't receive any of that kind of treatment. So those were just kind of examples they cited. And
yeah, and I suppose one of the things that stood out as well, it was a quote by Dr. Ibn Joseph. So basically, and it also kind of created some commentary afterwards on the site. And it was basically, her quote was, "How can you explain it that you go into so many organizations today and everybody is white?" And obviously, like some of the comments that maybe were coming in were, well, we're Ireland, like it's obviously a lot of people are white, but like maybe you can talk a little bit about the changing demographic and how maybe we should be expecting to see more diversity in the workplace and how that isn't happening in some companies.
Yeah, like you said, Maria, it's common knowledge that Ireland is becoming diverse. The population of Ireland isn't the way it used to be. So I found out, despite the narrative that migrants are, spongers, there's actually a rich talent pool among non-white Irish people or migrants in general. And there's evidence of this. There's evidence to show that a lot of people coming from other countries or Black people, they are highly qualified, but they get discriminated against. And it's only fair for these highly qualified people to be given a chance to prove their worth in some of these companies, but they don't get the shot. Like, they get discriminated against. And Ibn Joseph, who I spoke with, and she's done extensive research on this. And one of the telling things that came out from her study was that Black Africans are among they have the highest, they recorded the highest unemployment rate in Ireland. And mind you, these people are qualified. Like, most of them would have, say, maybe a master's degree or even like a bachelor's, but for some reasons, like, the way they sound, their accents, their names, they don't even get a shot, when they go for these interviews. So it's just a clear example that some people are not even given a chance at all.
Yeah, and I suppose, like, looking towards like what can be done and what's happened since. I know that the National Action Plan Against Racism featured in your report, and that actually came out this week. So, like, is that like, it seems to have been well received, but like, what will that do, and like, what can we look forward to kind of to improve this issue?
Yeah, so racism is so ingrained into. I'm trying to choose my words carefully here. Well, but racism has been, something that Black people, for example, would experience. It's been on for a long time, and it's not going to take just one policy to change it. I think there has to be consciousness, and there has to be training and retraining in Irish workplaces for people to understand what it means to not be racist. Like it's not just enough to say you are not racist, but you have to deliberately be anti-racist. And this comes in the policies of these companies. I know Ebun Joseph was telling me that unconscious bias training is not something that's been embraced in many workplaces. And even when it's done, it's not done properly. So these are the sort of things that needs to be done. And I think people from minority ethnic groups in Irish companies need to be listened to more. They shouldn't, their stories shouldn't be dismissed. And when you do things like this, you for example, the National Action Plan Against Racism, you just mentioned that, Maria, there has to be implementation. This is not the first time we've had that in Ireland, for example. So for some reason, it didn't work the last time. So I know a lot of people would be looking out for the implementation of National Action Plan Against Racism, and there's also legislation against racism coming up to ensure that if you're racist, you can be seen to have committed a crime, because that's not the case as it is in Ireland at the moment.
Yeah, so there's a lot to be done, but hopefully, as you're saying, it'll be implemented this time. But no, thanks so much, Joseph. And if you do have any questions for Joseph, just put them in the Q&A and we'll come to them at the end. But thanks a million for telling us about that. So we're going to go to our next investigation now. So it's a completely different topic altogether. It's on hydropower. So Alice is joining us for this investigation. So as I was saying at the start, Anthea Lacia was the reporter on this, but Alice did a significant amount of work and also travelled with Anthea to the Shannon to look at Ardnacrusha, which is our biggest hydropower station. So Alice, maybe just to start with you, just maybe a little bit of an overview of what is hydropower. You've been up close and personal to Ardnacrusha. Like, what is it and how did you find it?
Well, I think as soon as we knew we were going to do the investigation, we knew that we had to go down and have a look at it with our own eyes. And it's definitely true that when you're standing beside a hydropower dam and listening to the sound of the water coming through, and you realize just how turbulent it is, just how powerful it is, and that fish are having to swim through this, it definitely makes a difference to be on site. But to maybe take a step back, what we looked at was the Ardnacrusha hydroelectric station on the River Shannon, and it's something that Ireland should be very proud of. I mean, it's over 100 years old, or it's coming up to it being 100 years old, excuse me, and it's a real feat of engineering. But what they did in order to create the hydropower was there's two dams basically on the Shannon. Partine Weir splits the Shannon into two, and the old River Shannon continues the way it always has, and then the water is diverted to Ardnacrusha hydroelectric station, so that, and they can then control the flow that goes to the hydroelectric station because of that first dam at Partine Weir. And then once it reaches Ardnacrusha, then it goes through the turbines, and that water going through the turbines generates electricity. And at one stage, it powered most of Ireland's electrical needs. Now it's much less, only a couple of percent, but it does still contribute. But one of the problems, or the problem that the article was about, was that these are all very well, but it's a massive disruption for life in the river. And what I found really sad was that there have been attempts to make it easier. There's a fish lift at Ardnacrusha, which is quite funny. The idea that the fish arrive below the dam, go into kind of an area, wait until that fills up, and then they can swim out over the top is the idea. So there's some measures in place, but they're just not very effective, or in fact not effective at all in many cases. And I think that's the tragedy. It's not an either or. And some people reading the article sort of said, well, either we burn fossil fuels or we have hydroelectric power, and you know, which would you prefer? But actually it doesn't need to be that way. There are better ways of making the dams more fish friendly. And as I said, when you're there and looking at them, and you know, the rough concrete that the fish have to swim over, or eels kind of crawl over, just the sheer power of the water, yeah, it was quite impressive in a bad way.
Yeah, and I suppose just to give context, there have been fish kills in, like, there's a hatchery at Partine, and there's other areas where there have been huge thousands of fish killed, and also every year, and you can see this in the article, there's eels get absolutely smashed in the turbines. So the issue is that when eels swim down the river, they have to go through the turbines to, if they go that way, and then they can get really impacted.
That's a good point, Maria. Yeah, I didn't make that totally clear. There's the problem going upriver and downriver, and upriver there are some lifts or sort of mechanisms to help the fish, but downriver nothing at all, and so then it's really the salmon or the eel against the turbine. And when we went down, we didn't actually see any dead eels. It was the wrong kind of time for it, it seemed. And also, you know, it's a vast area. We took a boat out onto the Shannon to have a look. But the people we spoke to down there had documented really horrific injuries that the fish suffer, and they might not die directly going through the turbine, but then they're damaged. They've been injured and they don't survive for long after that. So
yeah, like one of the, maybe you can just talk about the turbulence a little bit, because you were actually, I suppose, just to give context as well, Alice was on a boat on the river right in front of Ardnacrusha, so she really got to see the turbulence coming down and the power of the water. But one of the things that really struck me was that some of the fish are getting the bends from this turbulence. So it's kind of so basically when they're going through the water or through the turbines, I think, like, you can get the gas built up in your body, and you get these kind of bends, like symptoms that divers would get, and that kind of causes injuries, which then they can die further downstream. So they mightn't necessarily be recorded as dead by the fish counters, but they might later die downstream, or kind of float down the river.
And actually so there's the bends is one of the problems. Also, another issue that eels in particular face is that they have quite thin skin, and then to compensate for that, they have sort of a mucus coating, which helps them slither places and keeps them protected. But some of the fish lifts, or when it's a kind of a manual process of, because some of these are, you know, in a way pretty low tech, you know, capture the eels above a barrier and wait till you've got enough, and then load them into a truck and bring them down below the barrier, and that can damage them too. And so that the handling leaves them vulnerable to infection, which then wouldn't be caught by the fish counters either, but then is damaging later.
Yeah, and I might just go through, you had sent one of the comments on that we had got in after the investigation, Alice, and it was about there's an eel fishing ban actually in place, because eels are critically endangered species, and similarly, like, obviously salmon are protected, there's other fish on the river that are protected that are impacted by this as well. But one of the people who commented said that, like, obviously there is a eel fishing ban, but then compared to maybe the impact that this is having, like all of the barriers, and I suppose all of the barriers build up. So you have Ardnacrusha, then you have Partine, and we looked at kind of all the barriers up the river. So yeah, like what kind of thoughts would you have on that in terms of
It's interesting. I think some of the people we spoke to would say that in an effort to do the right thing to protect critically endangered eels, the government said we'll stop eel fishing, which looks good on the face of it, but it's a small problem compared to the huge numbers that are being harmed going through the hydroelectric turbines and related barriers on the river. And to not look at that is a massive oversight. And the point, which I think, you know, is a fair point as well, is to say that when you had local eel fishers, it wasn't hugely industrial. It was often people who'd been in the area for a long time. Eel fishing was in the family, and they caught the eels, but they also were sort of stewards of the area. And so perhaps by banning it, you actually you almost erased one of the eel's greatest champions, because these were people who really wanted a healthy eel population, and who saw every day the impacts of other things, who would kind of lobby on behalf of the eels, and now eels perhaps lack a champion.
Yeah. And I suppose just to also, as the editor of this investigation, to give you a little bit of insight about how we structured it, because if you read it, it's structured quite differently from our normal investigations, and it's actually done by the weirs and the barriers along the Shannon. So I suppose our idea around that was that instead of kind of just a normal narrative piece or a normal article, we wanted to show what the journey would be like if you were a salmon or an eel kind of going up the river. So we started at the sea, and then you had to go up the river. So if you were an eel, it's to go up to mature, and if you're a salmon, it's to go up to spawn. And then the eels obviously travel back down the river and spawn. They have this fascinating life cycle that involves a huge journey across from the Sargasso Sea, and then salmon go back out to sea to mature. So they're kind of reverse cycles. But yeah, we showed like kind of the main barriers, and there was a lot of issues on the barriers with fish passes, like at Ardnacrusher, there obviously is a huge amount of issues in terms of having to go through turbines on the way down, having to get up this 30-meter fish lift on the way up. There's also some measures being put in place by locals, like at Castleconnell, they're putting gravel in place, trying to help with the spawning of the salmon. We've mentioned Parateen, it's another huge barrier. There's another weir at Killaloo, another one at Meelick, at Lone, Tarmanbarry, Ballintraw. So all of these add up. And I suppose one thing that really struck me was that experts said that, say, 30% going over a fish pass of fish is actually a really good number. So if you have 30% going over one fish pass, then 30% going over another, you can see how quickly the numbers diminish as you go upstream. So I suppose that's one of the things that we tried to illustrate throughout the piece. But yeah, no, thanks, Alice. It was a really interesting investigation, and it was great that you could go down and video it.
Yeah, it was I think it maybe wouldn't have made so much sense without the photos. It was a good example when images can really bring to the story.
Perfect. And we'll just go to our last investigation that we're going to kind of give a little bit of insight into, which is the most recent one, which was just published on Monday, and it was assessing autism. And Niall is here to kind of give a little bit of background into how we did it. And it was quite a different investigation. You might know Niall from all of his environmental work. So it's unusual that we were talking about the environmental work and Niall is talking about something else. So Niall, maybe you can give a bit of background about how it came about and how you did it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I'm kind of jealous in a way that I'm not talking about the journey from the Sargasso Sea over, because I'm so fascinated by that stuff. But it was a nice departure for me to work on something that is a bit more human focused than environmental focused. And I suppose for me, taking a step back and just being honest with myself, as these families are on this journey with their children to understand, autism within their family, I had to start at a very early phase in my journey and recognize that I know very little about this. And I think as a journalist, that's good to reflect on a process to go about finding your way on that journey. And in many cases, it's just by talking to people. So that was the most important first step for me. And we're very lucky in that so many families over the past few years came forward to us to share their stories, which is a difficult thing to do. It's not easy to just put your thoughts, put your feelings, put your own personal history into an email to a complete stranger, whether they're a journalist or not. But we're very grateful that we had, unfortunately, we had 20, 30 families contacting us in the last 2 years with their stories, and they're a fraction of the families who are waiting years for autism assessments for their children. So essentially for me,
just to give context to that, because this wasn't a fully funded investigation. And actually, Shall Not Pass was, but neither was Racism at Work. But they were both issues that we thought were really important to highlight. Hadn't really been, obviously, autism assessment has been in the news a lot, but it hasn't really had a huge amount of in-depth coverage and the impact of the families. And because we were contacted by so many people for both investigations, actually, we felt that we would do not as a huge investigation as we had planned, but we kind of limited the scope a little bit and went ahead with the investigation with support from our investigative fund. So again, it just shows that these are both huge issues, and we really, really wanted to get these issues out there. So sorry, Niall, if you want to continue there.
Yeah, no problems. Yeah, it was really just picking up the phone, calling these people, asking them, you know, would they be comfortable to share further details with me about their story? And in many cases, some people had contacted us, like I said, up to 1, 2, 3 years ago. And the first question I had was, are you in the same situation? And unfortunately, in 99% of cases, it was yes, or even worse. We're still waiting for an assessment. We received the assessment, we jumped over that hurdle, but then there's a brick wall on the finish line of this race because we're on a new waiting list to get the services required for their children, be it physiotherapy, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, therapeutic assistance, psychological assistance. They're really not there. So you're talking about families that we spoke to who identified autistic traits in their children as young, in some cases, as 9 months or a year old. We talk about early intervention. We talk about the importance of getting in there early with the supports for children, helping them to understand how their brain works, where they fit in the world, understand for their families to understand and be able to support their children adequately. The focus and the core message from the health services, from the government, from all the experts is early intervention. And even when families are identifying as early as possible, they're not getting that support in cases till their children might be 4, 5, 6, even later. You know, some of the families we spoke with were waiting 5, 6 years just to get their assessment. You're talking about issues in terms of the children themselves, like I said, not fully understanding how they interact with the world in terms of sensory issues, for example, not getting places within schools that might be required. Many autistic children will be okay or, you know, function well within a mainstream school setting, but some will require to be in an autistic class or in a specific school setting. If they don't have that assessment on paper, that written piece that says this is your diagnosis, you need the supports, there's no guarantee they will get those supports. We don't know where to put the resources. So the families in many cases will then have to go private. They're going into debt. They're spending money out of pocket. There's been recent studies, academic research that showed families are spending actually more per year than the state would actually spend on those services, because they have to either go to the private assessments or in terms of the income they lose through having to either go on part-time work or giving up their job to look after their child. So there's a lot of stress on the families. There's a lot of financial issues, and ultimately for the children themselves, they're waiting years to really be given that support that they deserve to understand their own neurodiversity. And it was a real eye opener for me, and it was a difficult story to produce, because you're hearing these stories that you wonder, how has this been allowed to happen for so long by the state?
Yeah, and I suppose just one thing you mentioned there is that kind of the importance of talking to people when you mightn't be too familiar with the subject at the start. Like obviously you dove in and by the end you were very familiar with this topic, but I suppose one thing to highlight about the space that we were given at Noteworthy, which is great, is that we do get that space to talk to people and kind of get the context. And maybe you can talk about it, Niall, is the tone and make sure we have the right language. And it's kind of similar to what we would have done in our lift out investigation on accessibility of public transport, to make sure we talk to disabled people, we talk to the right organizations, and similarly for both of our investigations on the traveller community, so Blind Justice and Tough Start, we made sure to really interact with the community and get everyone involved to make sure we got the right tone and culture and language. So for this one, what did you do, Niall, to kind of get that? Hopefully we got it right, but to get that right.
Yeah, it was a really important part of the process to make sure the language was right, the imaging we use. We obviously use graphics, and we approach several different, the families with autistic children, autism experts in the academic world, but most importantly, autistic people themselves and autistic-led organizations to see, what would be a good representation, what sort of imagery is not acceptable, what is acceptable, what is the best process we can go about the imagery, but also, of course, the language. Traditionally, autism, like many issues in Ireland, were treated from a more clinical or medical standpoint, and that's where the language has developed. So it would traditionally be someone with something, a child with something, rather than, in this case, an autistic person. That is a part of their identity, which is so important because, traditionally it has always been seen in that clinical sphere, which takes it a bit away from the person themselves, takes it away from an understanding of this is a part of me, this is how I work, and this is how I can function. Because there are elements, of autism that people can use in a way that is functional for them. It's an important part of their actual personality. So it's important that we got that language right, because we especially didn't want to talk to families and be very open and honest with them and hope that they're going to be the same with us, and then use language very clinical or medical that didn't represent the views of the community. So we took a lot of time in the interview process to ask very direct questions, to sort of put my ego to the side and say, I really need you to help guide me through this, because we want to be as respectful as possible. Talking to academic experts, and again, importantly, talking to autistic people and autistic-led organizations as well, to get the terminology and language right. And I really think we're able to do that, and the feedback and response has been really, really positive from the autistic community in terms of the language that we used in the reporting. And I think just for me as well, like on a personal standpoint, it was very important because I myself would identify as neurodiverse. I have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and I went through my teenage years not understanding my brain, not having the understanding, not even knowing what OCD was, what it meant, and having years of anxiety because of that. And I think when we represent these sort of these issues in that medical or clinical sense, or kind of make light of it in the language used, and that does happen in media as well. I've seen how impactful that was for me. So on a personal level, I really didn't want to sort of repeat that same thing in my own reporting on such a sensitive issue for so many families.
Yeah, and I think and thanks for sharing that, Niall, but that's the key. You don't want to, autistic people are at the center of this story. You don't want to use the wrong language or be autism is who people are. It's not with, as you're saying. So it's great that you were able to spend the time to do that. I suppose you spoke about the feedback there, and I'm just going to read a little bit. We got some great feedback on the piece, and one of the kind of resounding commonalities with the feedback were people telling their stories. And unfortunately, again, more and more people contacting us after the piece to say, this is happening to me as well. And we've been getting those emails kind of for the last 2 years, and unfortunately they're still coming. So yeah, one of the examples is someone said that been trying to get a psychiatric appointment for their daughter for self-injurious behavior, and everywhere they go, they're getting knocked back. Another person said that there's no state help, they're forced to go private and it's expensive. So just saying that parents just get the support from other parents. And if you live rural, good luck to you. Unfortunately, that seems to be the case in more than just this issue as well. And another feedback was, our boy is now 12 and doing so much better. We've been to hell and back dealing with the system and some incompetent people in the system, and just kind of emphasizing the stress on family relationships, on marriages, on siblings. And I suppose that's something that was reflected in the piece as well.
Yeah, and that was really important for us, because we really wanted to focus on the impact on the family more generally. One way, because there are genuine concerns, everything you listed there, it's not just the parents, it impacts siblings as well, and obviously the children themselves. But one thing we wanted to avoid was putting families in a situation of identifying their child, which we really wanted, unless they've unless they're public already, we would want to avoid putting families in that position and telling them, like, it's okay, your story is real. We have records, we have documentation to back it up. We know it's a real story, but is it correct to put their child's name and information on record when they can't make that decision yet in their life to go public? So that's why one factor from a narrative sense and an ethical sense was involving the family stories more generally. But also that's the reality of the situation. The families, so many of them have lost trust within the state authorities, within the health service, within government, within ministers. We've even experts. We've an expert in UCD who's herself autistic, has an autistic son in his 20s, saying, I've shook so many ministers' hands and it's the same message. It's a broken record repeated. The supports never come. And so many families have given that feedback. We had those comments on with the article, but also individual families contacting me and saying exactly that. We don't trust the state authorities. We only trust in the other families who are going through this, and the community organizations and family-led organizations who are supporting the autistic community. And that's a sad story, because that speaks to the real breakdown, the real lack of services, the real frustration that families are facing. And it epitomizes a very sad situation at the moment for so many families.
Yeah, and no, thanks, Niall, and thanks for filling us in there. Just again, if you do have any questions, we're going to come to them in a second, so make sure to put them in the Q&A. But Alice, just before we kind of wrap up, we just wanted to give a little bit of a preview. So your investigation is probably the next big one that's going to come out. It's called Watching the Watchdog. So Alice, maybe just give a little bit of preview about what you're working on and if there's any help that people can give you.
Yeah, sure, Maria. So that's I finished with the Shannon and moved on to the Gardaí. I'm looking at the Garda Síochána Ombudsman Commission, and that's a body here that is meant to be independent, and if you have a problem with the guards, you go to them. Obviously, if you have any other, if you've been a victim of a crime, you go to the Gardaí. But what happens if the Gardaí themselves have, in your view, mistreated you? Then you go to the Ombudsman Commission. But there's been questions, and I think it's fair to say, and they would say it themselves, that it's not always been the most effective organization. It can be quite slow, and there's also questions about how independent it is, because a number of the cases that come to GSOC, as the acronym, then get sent back to the guards themselves to investigate. And there's a question that might be some kind of a resource issue as well, or if there's sort of what they call service level complaints, things like discourtesy, they say, well, maybe this can go back to the guards, but it's not always clear how that decision is made. And how kind of the organization functions internally. And this is timely because at the moment going through the Oireachtas is the Policing, Security and Community Safety Bill 2023, which is before the Dáil at the moment. And that is going to reform actually not just the Ombudsman Commission, but also many of the a lot of the architecture of police accountability in Ireland. And the idea, as it relates to GSOC, as it relates to the Garda Síochána Ombudsman Commission, is that they'll reform the organisation. It'll become the independent police ombudsman. Currently, there are 3 commissioners who kind of sit jointly at the top. That'll be replaced with 1 commissioner and a deputy, or 1 ombudsman. It will be now. So the question really for us is, well, what have the issues been, and will this bill actually adequately address them? And because there's been a lot of police reform in Ireland in the last 20 years, and the question is, let's not do another reform if it's not going to be effective. And so that's what I'm doing at the moment. And I suppose you were talking about what I like, a call to help. I mean, I'm interested in speaking to anyone who's taken a case to GSOC, and I've spoken to a number of people, but for lots of reasons, people want to move on with their lives. They don't want to dwell on cases that they've taken to GSOC. If they've had a bad police experience, they kind of want to move on. So if anybody out there listening would like to speak to me confidentially, anonymously, I would love to hear their stories, because I think it's very important not just to look at the outside, but also the clients, the public, and how they feel like the organization is working for them.
Brilliant. No, thanks, Alice. And if anyone does have any experience with GSOC and they'd like to contact us, our email is information@noteworthy.ie. So make sure to give Alice a shout, and we'll pass on that email if if one of us gets that instead. And before we wrap up, I don't see any Q&A coming in. So obviously we've covered all the topics that people want sufficiently. But if there's anything that we want to talk to each other about, just kind of wrap it up. I think, Niall, you might have had a question there.
Yeah, it's just kind of building on from Joseph's great overview, and maybe to turn the mirror back on ourselves. I know this is something we've, regularly discussed among the team, and I think it's an increasing topic among media enterprises and journalists in general, is the lack of diversity within Irish newsrooms in general. And maybe for all of us, for Joseph, from his findings, like, do you have any position, or do you have any overview that you got about, like, sort of the diversity in Irish media, or how things can maybe improve within the journalistic world to make sure that in newsrooms we're reflecting the true diversity of Irish society in the 21st century?
Sorry, I was muted there. So yeah, you're quite right. The Irish media needs to be diverse. It's not diverse enough. I think a lot of people don't consider applying to certain positions in Irish media because they obviously don't see people who look like them there. So I think it's actually time for people who call the shots, editors or the management of different media companies, targets, people from minority backgrounds. And, I get this all the time. Or, when I say to people that I would love to see a more diverse Irish media, and they tell me, oh, well, the recruiter tells me, well, if people don't come up for positions, how would we, recruit them? I think that's the reason why people don't actually apply for certain positions. And I think it's actually, it reflects poorly on the organization if, certain group of people don't see your organization as worthy to be, to work for. So I think the more diverse the media is, the better the reach, and even in terms of the kinds of stories that will be covered, it will actually do a whole lot of ethnic minority people in Ireland so much good. And another thing too, which we might have in another conversation, is even in companies, this is not just about the Irish media alone. Even in companies where you don't have diverse staff, I think where you have diverse staff, I beg your pardon, we don't have enough people of ethnic minority in positions of authority. So it's not just about recruiting somebody who would do some task on the job. We need people who have, power to, for example, even in Irish media, like I don't think I know of any ethnic minority editor, because that's a position of power that you can determine the kind of stories that will be covered when you're in that position. So I think it will take some time, but it's something we should consider. It's not just about getting people into these places, it's also about giving them responsibilities. And it's not just about giving them because for the sake of it. We have a lot of people who are qualified to do this, but for some reason they don't get a foot in the door.
Yeah, no, and it's actually really interesting, Joseph, because it's something that came up a lot when we were doing our traveller investigations, because we were speaking to children, so traveller children, and asking them about their futures and like how they felt about jobs, and because they didn't see themselves in positions of power, positions and higher up, they kind of didn't feel like they could aim, or if they had aimed for that, people in positions of power like teachers or guidance counselors had kind of like almost put them in their place, as in like they were like, well, this isn't something you can do, which is absolutely terrible to do to a child. So I think like it's completely an issue that is across Irish society, and you can see it as well in politics, and like there's in the Dáil and Leinster House, like there's so few diverse voices there. Is there anything else then before we wrap up, everyone? Brilliant. Well, thanks so much. Or Joseph, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask Niall. It's actually very interesting, you know, how there's a lot of information I actually got from you, you know, that's from the PCD. So I know some families that have autistic kids, and just like you said, they're on the waiting list. They've been waiting for years. I just wanted to know, like, what did you sense some kind of certain level of hopelessness amongst those people you spoke to, or was it a case of they've been optimistic despite the number of years they've waited to get to see the doctors?
Yeah, unfortunately, hopelessness was really, you know, it really comes across. It's, you know, I think it's when people sort of very often make sort of not dark humor jokes, but sort of in, you know, just like making light of, if I would say, well, do you have any hope about the situation? I'd often get kind of a laugh, and you know, the response from families is, you know, very happy that the issue has been highlighted, but also some of them said like it just reminded them the hole they're in, and so many other families, that like this is the latest in a long series of articles on this issue, and I think for some they were happy to see it, but also reminded them of what they're still facing into. So unfortunately, I was like, hopelessness, some optimism. I guess it just depends on the family and how long they've been waiting, but not much optimism, which, you know, you don't want to see it, but you can completely understand it, and just hope in our way. I suppose all we can do is highlight this issue to the public, hope this has an impact on some policymakers, on members of the public, and, you know, the decisions they make, if they in activism or voting, or decisions they make at a local level in supporting communities. But I suppose also showing families that there are others out there going through the same situation as them, and at least they can have optimism that they can rely on each other through these community groups and support groups.
Brilliant. No, thanks very much, and thanks, Joseph. And thanks to everyone. We'll wrap it up there, and we'll probably have these updates every month or so, just to give you kind of a background glimpse on how we did our investigations, and a little bit of insight into things like what Niall was talking about there, how we spend time on getting the language right, getting the culture right, and things you wouldn't really notice perhaps if you were just reading the articles. But make sure to sign up to our Insider newsletter if you haven't already, for a behind the scenes glimpse into our work, and that's noteworthy.ie/newsletter. And until next time, I'll see you then. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.